Colleagues, welcome to this final full week of events organised by the European University Continuing Education Network, UKEN, as part of our Open Fora season on lifelong learning. My name is Kevin Orr. I am a professor at the University of Huddersfield in the north of England, and it is my great pleasure to be chairing these events this week. So this week, our topic is diversity and inclusion in higher education, what we have and what we need. Now, the pandemic has exposed and exacerbated already significant inequality throughout Europe, indeed throughout the world, not least in access to higher education. Access to a computer, decent Wi-Fi, and the space and peace to study at home became not just additional luxuries for students, but necessities for study as we moved online. And those students without those necessities have missed out. And those students who have missed out are often those from poorer backgrounds or from ethnic minorities. So how do we understand this well-established but newly exposed inequality, and how do we more effectively address inequality, diversity and inclusion as practitioners, researchers and policymakers who have an interest in continuing education or lifelong learning? By the end of this week, I hope we will be closer at least to some satisfactory responses to those questions. And to start this week, to start the discussion, I am completely delighted to introduce my colleague from the UK, Dr. Nalita James. Nalita is Director of Academic Studies in the Centre for Lifelong Learning at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. And she's also an Honorary Associate Professor in the School of Education at the University of Leicester. Until recently, Nalita was a very active chair of the Standing Conference on University Teaching and Research in the Education of Adults, SCUTREA, and she is currently a member of the European Stakeholder Reference Group in Adult Education, EPAL. Nalita is co-editor of the Journal of Studies in the Education of Adults and an editorial board member for the International Journal of Lifelong Learning. But above all else, I know Nalita to be an active advocate of lifelong learning and adult education. And with that in mind, Nalita will be presenting to us on the topic, Reimagining Lifelong Learning in Higher Education, How Can We Do It Differently? Now, just before I hand over to Nalita, who will speak for about 30 minutes or so, I would encourage you all to write questions and comments in the chat, and then I will put these to Nalita after her presentation. So I'm keen for everyone here to be involved. And with that, I will hand over to you, Nalita.
Thank you, Kevin. I hope everybody can hear me. What a lovely welcome. Thank you. I have a PowerPoint presentation to share, so I shall just deal with some technicalities and then I will make a start. But thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I think it's going to be a great week and I'm really looking forward to participating, not just today, but in the week to come as well, and taking part in lots of discussion around this issue. I hope you can see my PowerPoints as well. My presentation, but really it's not a presentation, it's more of, I want it to be a discussion as Kevin's identified, is to think about and really imagine what lifelong learning in higher education can actually look like. And I noted the session was billed as a masterclass, but I was joking with Kevin and colleagues earlier. I don't feel that it should be about that. I think it should be a collective discussion about, where would we like the sector to go, and what are the opportunities and possibilities. So what I'm going to reflect on today then is about how universities could reimagine the tradition really of continuing education or lifelong learning, where privilege is not given priority in education, and actually where instead we recognise diversity, we recognise equality and inclusion as the premises of HE in a different academic era. And as I said, I hope we can come together at the end to share our thoughts and reflections on that particular issue, and no doubt we'll be reflecting on that throughout the rest of this week as well. So just to think about that notion of lifelong learning in higher education and what does that mean, And there are many different policies, there are many different practices around lifelong learning in higher education globally. And I think we need to embrace the notion of lifelong learning and in terms of its broadest sense, so including the social, the cultural, and the economic development of communities and the region. And I've cited here something from UKEN, which I think is very apt for us to sort of reflect on as we progress the session today. And actually, on the surface, that seems a very inclusive standpoint and a very positive starting point that should reflect very strongly and influence the way that learners learn and teachers teach, and how higher education operates. And yet, I was looking at the recent UNESCO 2020 report on embracing a culture of lifelong learning that actually argues that in many education systems, lifelong learning is very often positioned on the periphery rather than a central tenet for education and social policies. And that's resulted in fragmented reforms and top-down procedures, effectively disconnecting lifelong learning from the core of education systems and policies. The challenge in this inclusive notion of lifelong learning, it is about recognition of diversity, but there are potentially conflicting ideas that actually can direct institutions towards going one way or taking a different stance in relation to practices and policies. And I'm going to explore that a little bit more as we go through the session. So any consideration of the role of universities in promoting lifelong learning then has got to rest on an articulation of the meaning of it for a particular institution, and then by extension, the values and the practices that are associated therewith. For me, the idea of an inclusive lifelong learning, and I'd be really interested in the chat to get to hear your perspectives on this, is around an inclusive lifelong learning that advances social integration and responsible citizenship. But that's actually really difficult to achieve when it's also seen as an effective tool for the improvement and growth for improving growth and in economic productivity, and particularly here in the UK, but also particularly in the global south, lifelong learning has actually become a central plank of economic expansion due to policies. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the vision of lifelong learning here in the UK is actually reflected in the industrial strategy and in the policies of countries such as China and Singapore, where despite many innovative lifelong learning initiatives, what we see is, as to quote Biesta, is an increasingly, lifelong learning is increasingly understood in terms of the formation of human capital and an investment in economic development. And I think that, for me, creates this challenge for universities around the notions of being world-class, being at the forefront of research, being performance-based, and yet open access. So how do we deal with those challenges and tensions? And there's also a political rhetoric here. And while that political rhetoric suggests there's an appreciation of the wider value of learning, policy very often falls short of the ambition to create that learning society in which learning for employability and skills can actually be valued alongside learning for personal growth, for community development, for active citizenship and the common good. And linked to that university conflict of being world class, what many of the kind of common sense elements of universities, of their mission of access and opportunity, like innovative teaching, like access and widening participation, like social mobility, how universities link with their local communities and support their local communities. It's very often on the periphery or conspicuously absent. So this, for me, raises questions as to whether there's room in this, in a new order, a new university, for broad conceptions of lifelong learning that actually are linked to personal fulfillment and democratic participation. I think another question for me concerns the kind of the narrow focus on economic value and economically valuable skills, alongside the normalization and the acceleration of hybrid or blended models of teaching and learning, which have expanded since the pandemic, and can deliver a mix of creativity and flexibility and willingness for individuals to want to learn the skills and knowledge they need to play a full part in society. But I think, as Kevin's alluded to, it's not an equal playing field. So the OECD survey of adult skills has provided evidence of how we live in a society where there's a pernicious digital divide, with the shift to virtual classes highlighting other dimensions of unequal access in this new normal, which impacts on on people's abilities to engage in learning. So areas with poor or non-existent Wi-Fi, learners with low quality equipment, poor digital literacy skills, having confidence with platforms like Moodle and Zoom. This creates this Matthew effect where hybrid models of learning serve the already highly educated people. And so for HE to normalise this curriculum in an attempt to ensure pedagogic continuation, it actually can really rob us of the opportunity for an open discourse on how the sector can be actually emancipatory for all students. And for me, it's not about condemning what we have and in terms of a hybrid model of working, which is particularly prevalent at the moment in the UK context of lifelong learning. But it's actually about critically reflecting on ethical challenges relating to transforming practices. So we're not just merely shuffling around old problems. We need to think harder about the place of lifelong learning in our HE systems. So it's about all of us learning to learn at this point in time, and we have that opportunity to do so. The pandemic itself, I think, has offered the opportunity to rethink not only new pedagogical possibilities, but more fundamentally for me, it's about the basic purposes of lifelong learning in higher education, and how a renewed vision of education might be harnessed. And in the special edition of COVID-19 and Higher Education, which was in the Journal of Education, Philosophy and Theory, Peters et al. Argued that our universities need to ensure they reconstruct their curricula, recognising it is the individual that precedes intellect in what we teach or are taught. And this should embrace a unity, truth, and goodness of all being. So that approach for me shouldn't be an afterthought of metrics and models and experiments, but as an approach which is actually truly embedded in the curriculum, in which learning can be valued for its own sake, and in which we can expand human capacities and possibilities, allowing us to lean into our curiosity, really, without always having to think about the the market value of our interests, or to stay up to date with most recent developments, or gain skills to be more competitive in the job market. So just imagine our education agenda that involves, embraces adult education and lifelong learning in its broadest sense through both formal and non-formal education. To do as the UAE back in 2008 committed to, having a broad spectrum of students taking part in higher education, to ensure and take advantage of the pursuit for culture and interests, and for high quality and relevant higher education throughout their lifetime. So just imagine that HE system, where the most fundamental ambition can be to allow people to cultivate their interests and acquire understanding, experiences and skills in disciplines and areas that excite and intrigue them. But how can we imagine this vision within a neoliberal model HE system that is underprivileged by, which is underpinned by privilege and inequality and competitiveness, and very often can work against aspirations of flourishing and fostering our capacities. And as Ted Fleming and others have argued, neoliberalism doesn't aim to increase the well-being of everybody, but increases social inequality, which in turn drives a more competitive society and economy. So in this environment of lifelong learning in higher education, we're often tasked with producing resources of the workplace and through a leaner system of education. It also means that we're preparing our students to be work ready and to learn to earn. To tackle these issues is to think about a reorganisation of higher education, where it's not just dominated by formal learning and not mostly reserved for young people. And we know this is problematic in at least two ways. First, not everyone can afford to pursue an educational degree, and pursue it at a young age. Education and attainment, as we know, is highly influenced by socioeconomic status and privilege, and that in turn creates barriers to post-secondary education. Secondly, even for those who have the opportunity to study at a young age, restricting formal education to such a limited time span fails to acknowledge the way that we evolve throughout our lives, and way in which we develop a wide array of interests that might not even have been present when we were young enough to study. So if we were to think about higher education as a chain of progression for continuing our education and our skills that stretches over the life course, I would offer that opportunity for what I think about as learning for integrated life, where our learning path can be a continual journey with ongoing opportunity for learning and for skills as enablers of success and purpose. But to deliver this requires access to a system of learning that's fit for purpose and that can capitalise on that journey. So this perspective recasts the role of higher education and highlights the need for universities to transform into lifelong learning institutions. This implies a responsibility both to prepare students to become lifelong learners and to provide lifelong learning opportunities to all people, irrespective of age and of educational background. It's a change mandate which requires more openness in terms of access to educational institutions through different types of learning opportunities, multiple learning pathways, dependent on the learner's abilities and needs. But at the moment, oops, so I hope you can still see me. But at the moment, we're constrained through rigid funding schemes, admission criteria, low recognition of non-formal and informal learning, systems that which discourage teachers from introducing new pedagogies, amongst others. It's clear that the proposed transformations would require fundamental changes and appropriate resources to implement them. And it would also affect the role of teachers and the way in which they develop and apply their pedagogies, with a shift perhaps from being an instructor of knowledge to being more of a guide and facilitator in learning processes. So in addition to subject-specific learning, teaching could actually focus more on fostering and instilling curiosity and helping students to maintain it. What if lifelong learning could reinvent the business of higher education? To return to where I started, the choice to adopt lifelong learning as a feature of an approach to higher education has got to be derived from a declared set of values about what the purpose of learning is through life and learning for life. The impact of the adoption of lifelong learning in this way could extend its reach into higher education, transforming practices within it, positioning learners to engage more deeply with a wide range of learning contexts. And if higher education can acknowledge the multiple forms of learning and embed those into their strategies and practices, then HE could have the potential to be truly inclusive. It requires those sustained efforts and major changes in the way in which lifelong learning in higher education is conceptualized, delivered, organized, structured, funded, and valued. For universities to pivot to lifelong learning then, operational models and mindsets have got to shift greatly. A focus on a 3 or 4 year undergraduate education is insufficient. Incentives are needed to attract would-be learners at whatever age into a lifetime association with higher education. And I believe our role must be long-term capacity building, enhancing students for a lifetime of creativity and agility, but as short term as well, so just in time responsive preparation. So to do this requires courage and a spirited conviction that all knowledge is worthy of investment. Do our universities assume that lifelong learning is a part of their core mission? For me, they must do. But it's not enough to just say, we have to learn. Not enough to just say it, we've got to learn to provide programs and teach based on the needs of our learners. This approach to lifelong learning in HE, I hope, move us some way towards a more equitable and a more and learning which is not individualized, where there's less deficit models of learning and could bring about both the changes to the way in which HE models itself at the moment. Finally, universities have got the possibility post-pandemic to be places of compassion, of wisdom and worthiness, to reflect on those systems and procedures that they have in place. They can become places where prior privilege doesn't actually give priority and engagement, where respect can flourish for students, irrespective of age or background, and where recognition of diversity, equality, inclusion are actually the premises of both informal and formal education, and where people can flourish. And for me, this is an opportunity which is a new educated focus, not a business one. Thank you.
Thank you, Nolita. Thank you very much indeed. I'll ask you to stop sharing, and I'll ask people to turn on their cameras so we can join each other in Congress to discuss the important issues that Nolita has raised. You've provided us with a critique of what drives higher education policy at the moment. You've offered us a reconceptualization of higher education that puts lifelong learning at the centre. And with that, you have offered us a recasting of the role of universities, and indeed the responsibility of universities for not just economic, but also personal development. This is a reinvention of higher education. Now, I have a number of questions to ask you to start with, but colleagues, please put your hands up or put your questions in the chat, or comments in the chat, and I will put them to Nolita and indeed to everyone else. But perhaps, if I may, I'm going to make a start and just pose some questions to you, Nolita. First of all, just in terms of what is driving higher education policy, and is there? Clearly, universities have become, well, they probably always were, but certainly have become highly competitive organizations where we are placed into league tables, national league tables, international league tables, QS 200, QS 300, and so on. Is there an inevitable tension between that and lifelong learning? Can the two things coexist, do you think? The competition between universities for position and a commitment, a meaningful commitment to lifelong learning?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think I think the continuing education has been a core part of the mission of universities since the sort of Middle Ages. And when I was doing a bit of research around this, I was trying to get a sense of the history of, well, where has this notion of continuing education and lifelong learning and its linkage to higher education come from? And I think there is a responsibility for higher education, and to ensure that it has a place and a heart within the region of the locality that it is placed within, in terms of supporting its local community to being able to access higher education. But at the same time, in doing that, and I think about my own institution, who I'm very new to, I think in doing that, there is this real tension between that and being renowned, being world-class, being international, being global. And very often, and I'd be really interested to see what the views of other people are who are working in the life learning context. Very often, lifelong learning and continuing education gets pushed towards the periphery. Alongside that, if you think about policy context, there is a recognition of the fact that, particularly in the UK, we have a workforce where we have individuals that are underskilled, skill sets are changing, the economy is changing and requiring different skills. So I think there is a real role for higher education here to look at how it can support the economy in delivering that ambition, and how as professionals and practitioners of higher education, how we can support that agenda.
So you're suggesting that even as things stand, we can make a difference, which I think is a positive message.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, even despite the tension. And look, I'm posing this to you. It's kind of an internal question for me, and I would be interested in other people's thoughts about this. Why why has human capital theory remained so powerful, so mainstream, despite its many weaknesses theoretically and indeed in application? Why are universities still driven, and not just universities, policymakers, still driven by human capital theory, which you drew attention to?
I think there is one argument that there are indeed economic benefits to, sort of going back to your original question, Kevin, which there are economic benefits which cannot be ignored around being international, around international recruitment, and this need to ensure that as a sector we are seen as being world-renowned, which really underpins that notion of human capital kind of theory and this neoliberalist model of higher education, which is very, very marketized and actually is very individualistic. I mean, it's a really difficult question for me to answer, but I think it comes down to the positioning of higher education, which is underpinned by a sort of industrial strategy of productivity and the economic benefits of higher education.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose also the argument that you're putting forward, Nalisa, is a reasonably complex one, whereas human capital theory has at least in its most basic form, as a kind of an alluring common sense about it. You invest in the individual, the individual can make their way in the world. However,
and as we know, that is not always the case, actually.
Right, absolutely. Now, there's some other questions have come in, which I'll put to you. And if people want to ask their own questions, please put your hands up, or if you want to join the discussion, that would be great. Just a few questions that come in. Ingrid has asked, are the pedagogies which are more likely to encourage a culture of inclusion in lifelong learning very different to the ones proposed by active learning? What would you say, Nalisa, and indeed other colleagues?
Just repeat that, sorry, Kevin.
Yes,
just cut out.
Sorry. Are the pedagogies which are more likely to encourage a culture of inclusion in lifelong learning very different to the ones proposed by active learning? In other words, is active learning, pedagogies associated with that, are they entirely aligned with lifelong learning?
From my own experience, and yes, I'd certainly be interested to know what other people think about this. I think that the nature of the learners that we certainly see at the University of Warwick very often respond very positively to the kind of notion of active learning, drawing on their experience, drawing on their life-wide skills. And actually, we do encourage our learners to bring those skills into their learning in the way in which we deliver the curriculum. But I think there's an issue really around, and I think I raised this briefly, around how we can embed, when we're delivering subject skills, the more broader life skills as well, which I think are so very often missing from the curriculum more generally.
What kind of things do you mean, Nalisa, by life skills?
I'm just thinking about some of those transferable skills, really, as well as all personal skills that I think very often get pushed to the periphery of delivering a curriculum. And I think certainly within the social sciences, I've seen a much greater push towards sort of trying to build those into the curriculum, which is part of an assessment of those skills.
Yeah, thank you. And I have a question here from Oliesia. In your opinion, and I'm going to respond to this as well, actually, in your opinion, what is the most important challenge that British universities face in the process of modifying lifelong learning? Well, I mean, I would say I think the most important challenges are to do with funding and to do with the way that universities are measured. Part-time students are not as well funded as full-time students. Part-time students tend to be mature. And also, in terms of competition, you know, what I am measured on as an academic, it has got to do with undergraduate students, not undergraduate students, full-time undergraduate students who tend to be aged 18 to 21, rather than my mature students. So what I am measured against is not aligned with lifelong learning. So I think that those kinds of incentives need to change within higher education in the United Kingdom. And look, that's not impossible. You know, I'm not talking about revolution here. I am just talking about slightly different incentives to mean that there is an equal, a level playing field, people like to talk about, between mature students and traditional young students. Nolita, what do you think?
I would agree with that. I think the way we are measured in the UK, so for example, we are measured by the TEF, which is the Teaching Excellent Framework. Then we have a REF, which is a Research Excellent Framework. Plus we've got HEFGE, and really that all of that, what Kevin's alluding to, and all of that, and the way in which we are measured is about the full-time undergraduate, not about the part-time mature. At the same time, and this goes back to my point of lifelong learning, very often in the UK higher education system being on the periphery of university policy and procedure. Yes, there may well be reference to access and widening participation in universities' missions and strategies, but actually that's not about part-time mature students. That's actually about widening participation for a particular age group, which is usually about 18 to 25, for those ones seeking full-time access to HE.
Yeah. And Eva, I'll bring you in just a second. I want to just pose Christina's question, because Christina was asking you in particular, Nolita, has your university started with this path? And she makes the point later on, because it is still the case that there are more male professors than female. Absolutely. And certainly within the UK, there are a truly tiny number of Black professors, whether Black or whether male or female. Nolita, how would you respond to that?
I think the question was, has my university gone down this pathway? I have been in post my university for, I think this is my 10th week, and I would love to say yes, but I'm afraid my answer is going to be no. And in my new role, I have heard from my colleagues very much how they feel on the periphery of the university in terms of how it conceptualizes lifelong learning, the top-down procedures which don't fit the kinds of students that we have. Just think policies and procedures relating to things like extension requests, mitigating circumstances, examinations, timetabling. So we have a long way to go. I don't know if there's anybody here from the University of Warwick in this room, so I'm just mindful of what I'm saying, but that is the frustration.
Yeah.
This is the problem, because there's no one from the university there from Warwick, because since we all a group of people who really believe in lifelong learning, who have been suffering within our institutions that lifelong learning becomes more important, or as you said, a primary issue, but it does not, because we're still the same here in the room as we have been 10 years or 15 or 20 years before, and we will be. And otherwise, there's no one else from the Warwick institution, from the university, or from our institution here. We'll keep talking about it, but we will not be able to start this path.
I fear you're quite right, Christina, that there is a concern precisely in that, is who is here, who is involved in this kind of discussion. Eva, can I bring you in, please?
Yeah, thank you. I would not see it as so depressing as Christina sees it. So sorry, Christina, otherwise I would have stopped already working in this field. But I think, thank you very much, Nolita. And I have actually 2 points. One is about the profile of the university, or to bring actually to make lifelong learning the core mission of the universities. And I think what I see in Germany and what I like about it, that it depends on the mission of the university as such, because we have universities who have a broad social, mission, and there are others with a more professional mission. So I think we also need to look at that. But I would strongly support this idea of you need to get it in the core mission. And so I think there could be more, and I see that in Germany for the last at least 10 years, it's quite strong, also funded, that you go closer to the work-related lifelong learning, so more to reskilling, upskilling, academization, things like that. But I think this is just one part. But I was a bit, I don't know. When I talk about the UK and lifelong learning at the UK, I always learn quite a lot about the widening participation part, because as German-speaking person, I never had this idea how much we could think about our students and about widening participation. And for me, actually, this would always be a core part of university lifelong learning. So it was strange for me when you now said, well, you know, we always think just about widening participation, but I think that is something that others university also often miss, you know, that this is also one very important part. So maybe you want to say something on that, because for me, this would be really relevant also when it comes down to lifelong learning. So thank you.
Thank you, Eva. And Lolita, would you like to come back on that? And also, I'm going to, in a moment, I'm going to invite Ethelberto, who said that it's not all happening, it is changing quickly elsewhere, but perhaps, Lolita, can I bring you in first, and then I'll see if Ethelberto would like to say anything.
Eva, is your question around that actually you're surprised that from what I was saying, that there is not an emphasis on widening participation in terms of lifelong learning? Is that what you mean? Sorry.
No, I understood you that you would say lifelong learn, that you would not put widening participation to lifelong learning. That's what I understood. Sorry, maybe I misunderstood you.
No, I mean, what I think I'm saying is that in universities' strategies and missions, very often there is this
notion of access and widening participation, and lifelong learning is in there. And I think perhaps Kevin will echo me when I agree with me when I say this, but it is not about part-time or not about mature students in that sense. It has a very, very different focus. And it's very often on the periphery, or it's a periphery of our policies around widening participation. And I have in the past sat on widening participation committees, and very often I'm the lone voice in the committee talking about our mature students and what they're, how we can enable them to access higher education.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I'm completely committed to widening participation. It's been a very important project within higher education for quite some time within the United Kingdom. But it is, and to be clear, I am answerable in relation to widening participation. In a few weeks' time, our scores in relation to the diversity of our students and their attainment has decreased over the last year, and I am answerable for that. I need to explain why that's happening and what I'm doing about it. But I think that I would say two things. That first of all, widening participation in higher education is not the same as social mobility, never mind social justice, where people go after higher education, that has not particularly changed despite widening participation. But also, I agree with Nolita that widening participation is very often, not exclusively, but often about increasing the number of full-time undergraduate students, or increasing the diversity there. I'm going to ask Jane to come in a moment. I just wanted to give Ethelberto a chance, if you wish to expand on what you were saying, that it's not in all EU countries that is changing quickly. Would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah.
Well, just to remind that in these past 10 years, we are observing a quickly change, not only on the female-male aspects of higher education, because in most of our EU countries, ladies are now, as students, the majority of the students in higher education. And they also leave higher education in first places. So this is a really important change. And the other thing is that we are observing in the secondary education and basic education that the females are now the great majority. And we are saying now in Portugal that we are losing teachers, and the majority are female. They are occupying the posts. So perhaps in quite a few years, we will observe a less percentage of males as teachers. So this is the point. But the other point that is changing, that you must observe, is about the economics. Really, I'm worried about the process of getting higher education for economic reasons, more and more. On the contrary of that, we are observing that higher education should be an open and free process for everyone, and for free. And it is not observing that. The budget on education is less and less in all EU countries. So we must change also that. That is only my 2 points. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Thank you for raising those points. Jane, I'm going to ask you to come in. Jane Wormald.
Oh, hello, thank you. And that was really interesting, Nolita. And I think, you know, as people have said this, what I'm wondering is that whether, you know, we will have to be more sneaky with this in terms of addressing that economic side of things, and maybe to really highlight how valuable, in all the ways we know that lifelong education is, but also how that's going to benefit society economically as well. And I think that's needed for people joining the higher education. And it is about, you know, wanting to be able to afford. Sorry,
You're just breaking up slightly, Jane. I wonder, could you repeat that last point?
I'm sorry, my internet's unstable, but you get my drift.
I think, Nolita, would you like to? Well, we do, absolutely. I think you're suggesting, Jane, especially when you're saying we need to be sneaky, that we have to be somehow subversive, that we have to find a way around existing procedures in order to promote lifelong learning. Is that fair? Is that what you're suggesting?
I think it's going to be very difficult to do a full-scale change unless we can say, you know, this is going to help your business model as well. Yeah.
I think that lines up with what I'm just reading in the chat from Marcia Elena. Nolita, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea of being sneaky and to sort of almost play the system in that sense is actually really, really important. And I think that we're kind of at that point where really as to how we can, and I'd be interested to people to respond to this, but how can we as educators of lifelong learning, how can we raise our profile, you know, within the institutions in which we work, you know, at all levels across the institution, from those, you know, sitting on senior committees, through to executive committees. Because I think this is where it's really challenging when, as a centre or a department for lifelong learning, you're often pushed, you know, the students themselves, they already feel on the periphery, staff already feel on the periphery. So how do we overcome some of those challenges of ensuring that actually the significance importance of lifelong learning and enabling all adults to access higher education. How is that message better heard and taken seriously? And I think there's also a sort of need or an urgency really to find a way to encourage universities to be sort of more adaptive, really, and have and be more open, really, to different models and ways of delivery, which I think particularly in the UK system, we are not. You know, we are, as I said, very much focused on the kind of 3 or 4 year, undergraduate degree model, because that's what we're measured against.
Thank you, Nolita. Ole, speak to us from Estonia.
Hello. I listen your discussion, and I would like to say that I think Estonia is a bit different from other Europe. And in Estonia, in our university, actually, we have more learners than students, 3 times more. So it's for Estonia, it's really a huge amount, and in Estonia in general, the universities are actually bigger continuing education providers. I mean continuing education, not degree studies, but short courses, and in total the amount is more than, I think, 70,000 participants, and 40,000 from our university. So it's quite huge amount. And I don't know, maybe it's the reason when we started, university actually saw this providing continuing education as additional income possibility or something, because in Estonia higher education is not very well paid anyway. So they need additional resources and the project work, and we had this open university period where there was the students had to pay for their studies and so on. But in general, higher education in Estonia is free. There are only few exceptions, but continuing education or short courses are usually for additional fees. But of course, there are different financial schemes available for certain target groups, but in general, companies are paying for their staff for additional training, and they order some courses, but also we also provide courses for fees. We have quite many MOOCs which are available for free. So it's we have courses for children already, for elder people, actually, like third age university. So the variety of target groups, and really, I don't know, somehow we manage. And then we have, I started at the Continuing Education Center in 2001. So it's quite a huge time ago, and all the time actually the numbers have gone up. So we started with 10,000 participants in continuing education. Now we have 40,000. So it's really a huge race of continuing education learners through this period. But of course, we had done a lot of work also. There has been a role of lobby among faculties, among this leadership and so on. So it's need a bit of work, of course. And for second period already, the university mission is said that the university would like to be a lifelong learning university, and it includes not only degree, not continuing education, but also degree studies, and also staff development. So it's there are 3 aspects. So yeah, thank you.
That's fascinating, Ole, and it raises so many questions for me. But allow me just to pose one. what is the difference in terms of the way that the universities are funded, or is it about the expectation of what universities are for? Or is there something else? Why does this look so different to what many of us are experiencing, but certainly what we're experiencing in the UK?
Well, I actually didn't know, but I just started to wonder about that, because when we started, this budget for university was not so high. And there was a really lot of project work for scientific work, research, and so on. And it's still available a lot. But there is funding is actually changed also through this period, because just like now, 6, 7, or even 8 years ago, they changed a law that no paid degree studies are allowed. There are only few exceptions, and you have to get promise from this Ministry of Education to provide this fee degree studies. But until that period, we had a lot of this degree studies available for fees. Yeah. And now, and if it turned, actually the amount of financing from the ministry actually didn't cover all these needs. Yeah, actually, and that it was not enough, and somehow this continuing education was seen as maybe one possibility to cover the difference, and already for that period we had many good lecturers and professors who got additional financing through these open university studies, which were degree studies. And after that period, they didn't got it anymore. So they saw the potential in continuing education. Maybe, I don't know. But I think that there are some relationship, and if they had already really got some higher fees or higher payments from university for additional work on weekends or so what, and they were just started to think that maybe this is a possibility. And actually many good professors have said that if they are providing continuing education for professionals, they got a lot of information back about the state of art in companies. In real life, and they actually take it as learning space for themselves. So it's a question of that motivation, self-motivation as well.
Absolutely, and I can see that Pascal has his thumb up, and indeed, I'm sure many of us are giving up the thumbs up. I think that's a rather nice place to finish our discussion, actually, that there are other visions of higher education, even that exist within Europe at the moment. So if I may, first of all, colleagues, may I thank Nolita James very much for your introduction and for starting what has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the week.
Me too, very much indeed. And tomorrow we've got Julie Wietrich and our own Carme Royo talking about the Inclusive Higher Education Project. That's at the same time, same place tomorrow. Thank you very much, colleagues, and I look forward to seeing all of you again on Tuesday. Enjoy the rest of your day or your evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.